Welcome to another episode of FishingLocalWaters.com. Today I'm going to talk to you about prisoners, prostitutes, and alligators. And it all starts right down there on George Street in Cincinnati, Ohio. So we'll be right back and we'll tell you all about it. Looking forward to it. Welcome to another episode of FishingLocalWaters.com. Remember, if you're fishing, you're almost always fishing in someone's local waters. So when on private land, talk to the owners and ask permission. And always be courteous and good stewards whenever you're on private or public properties. As a reminder, if you haven't already, please subscribe below. It helps us and allows us to keep you informed. As always, we hope you enjoy this segment of FishingLocalWaters.com. We opened this episode standing on a hilltop located in Devoe Park in Covington, Kentucky, looking across the river and into the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Prisoner Lake is also in Devoe Park and located just down the hill from this overlook. Now, Kentucky boasts 44 fishing in neighborhood lakes in 28 counties. They are also known as Fins Lakes, F-I-N-S lakes. As part of the Fins program, this 3.8-acre lake is stocked with catfish up to 4 times a year and is also stocked with rainbow trout in the spring and fall and largemouth bass and sunfish as needed. This lake was once a stone quarry that existed before the Devou family presented the property to the city for use as a park in 1910. After the city was deeded to park, a rock crusher was purchased in 1916, and several small storage buildings were constructed, and prisoners from the Covington jail were put to work in the quarry. It is reported that several prisoners escaped, or at least didn't return to their given cells that evening. There would be no way of knowing the full details of an unaccounted for prisoner. Over the next few years, the level of the quarry was steadily lowered, and by 1924, the quarry had been transformed into a large lake in which the locals dubbed Prisoners Lake. And yes, per Rick Robinson, a local author, there are 2 alligators who apparently took a liking to the lake after they escaped from a temporary holding pen adjacent to the Beringer Crawford Museum that is located just up the hill from the lake. Elements of the story can be found in his 2013 book, Alligator Alley. Now, per the story, the alligators were caught and last seen in the back of a pickup truck. But, like the missing prisoners, the historical trail seems to run cold after that. As historians, we often dance with the ghost of the past. As I researched William P. Devou Jr., I unearthed descriptions of him as being a slumlord, a recluse, odd, a miser, and unlikable. On the other side of the ledger, I found historians who felt an obligation to say something good and patronize an individual who I have come to believe cared little about public opinion. It wasn't until I pulled on 2 historical threads, one at the beginning of his life and one near the end, that the fascinating character of William P. Devou Jr. began to come into focus for me. The first is that the Spring Grove Cemetery lists his father as being a wholesale milliner. I may add that this wholesale milliner was successful enough to purchase 700 acres in Covington, Kentucky, build a large home, and send his 2 boys to Germany to be educated. There was something more. A milliner is not a hat maker. A hatter is a hat maker for men, and primarily a male occupation. A milliner makes hats and bonnets for women, and that was primarily a female occupation. In fact, during this period, to be called a male milliner was a derogatory term that questioned the individual's manhood and his morals. It does not appear that William P. Devou Sr. was either a hatter or a milliner, but a supplier to the female-operated fashion industry in the city, and perhaps contracted with those female milliners to supply finished goods to retailers such as John Shillitoe, George Washington McAlpin, John Washington Ellis, and the Pogue brothers. The occupation of being a dressmaker or a milliner did have a certain reputation, for good wives could be found within the shops of the dressmaker and milliners. They understood the importance of appearance and fashion. They worked hard, and well, they could sew. And those men who wanted a kept companion needed to look no farther than the head milliner herself or her ambitious assistant. And those looking for a very short-term relationship needed only look for the milliner who hated to sew. This guidebook to the profession warns about these scenarios. It contains a delicately worded moralistic warning against romantic and sexual temptations. It wrote that many thousands of girls employed as you are have fallen into guilt, misery, and the grave. Exactly how William P. Devou Sr. made his money and how it intertwined with the milliners remains unclear to me. There was a wholesale clothing district where Fort Washington Way is now located. This would have been just south of the Burnett House and just above the public landing where 5,000 steamboats arrived and departed each season. The railroad yards were 10 blocks to the west, and the Miami-Erie Canal ended at the Ohio River 10 blocks to the east. This is where everything flowed into and out of the city, and it was on these streets that William P. Devou Sr. made his money, and money he did make. Over time, he and the Devou family purchased 700 acres of undeveloped land adjacent to Covington, Kentucky. He built a large house and sent his 2 sons to Germany for high school and college. When William and Charles came home from college, they joined their father's business. Some say that William left the company to venture into real estate. I believe the family was already in real estate. The names on many of the property listings have both William and Charles names, and many just say William P. Devou, with no junior or senior listed. And some say ETAL, which means and others. Therefore, I'm uncertain where the senior stops and the junior begins. Regardless, we know that William P. Devou Sr. had previously purchased land in Covington, and now his sons were purchasing property and helping expand the business empire. In 1870, Jim Crow in the South was pushing blacks north to Cincinnati for a better life, and the invention of the sewing machine and ready-to-wear clothing had changed the seamstress and milliner's trades. And at the same time, the women's equal right movement of the late 19th century was well underway. As all these elements converged onto 2nd Street in Cincinnati, William P. Devou Jr. set his sights on the West End and started purchasing property and providing needed housing for the working class of Cincinnati. In a relatively short period of time, he owned most of George Street and was renting to several industrial-minded females. Some of the noted madams of the area included Molly Chambers, who was supposed to tip the scales at 300 pounds. There was Dora Green, who was known to lend a lot of money to the police officers. Edna, that owned the Edna Creighton Resort, and Belle Kirk's house was located at 141 George Street. And let's not forget the personal battle between Florence Gossett and Helen Cromwell. Helen went on to write 2 books. One is called Dirty Helen, and the other is called Good Time Party Girl. It wasn't long before these enterprising ladies caught the eye of the Cincinnati Post, and on July 11th of 1883, they wrote an article about the good people of Cincinnati, complaining about the unchecked ruckus and ongoings on George Street. These 4 blocks on George Street and the neighboring 6 and Longworth Street had become known as the Tenderloin District, and there was estimated to be as many 70 brothels and some 350 ladies who elected not to be church-going milliners or seamstresses. To some, the ladies of the house lacked a certain moral expectation. However, they did seem to have an eye for fashion, for many of the brothels were elegantly and finely furnished with all the trimmings, including the finest fabrics of the Victorian period. The newspapers reported that on any given night, city officials, politicians, industrialists, and bankers could be found in this entertainment district. In fact, Boss Cox, the local chairman of the Republican Party and one-time mayor of Cincinnati and ward boss, owned a saloon on the corner of Longworth and John Street. This was the heart of William P. Devou's real estate empire. He owned around 120 buildings inside this district. In Helen Cromwell's book titled Good Time Party Girl, she referenced Mr. Devou pushing a cart through town and that he married a colored woman. The same description is mentioned in a book written about the history of blues in the Queen City titled Going to Cincinnati. I'm still looking for and searching for this mysterious woman. With each building William P. Devou Jr. purchased, he unknowingly laid another block for the jail that he was building for himself on George Street. For each building consumed more and more of his time and commitment. Buildings and people do have a common reality. You can apply paint over time, but eventually everything wears out. For now, money needed to be made and every dollar needed to be squeezed out of every asset. As immigrants, blacks in rural America migrated to the city, they needed a job and a place to live nearby. William P. Devou Jr. and others were buying buildings, turning them into multiple tenants, and filling them as quickly as possible. The rent money was used to purchase the next building. Based on the sheer number of tenants and the buildings Mr. Devou now owned, collecting rent itself would have been a full-time job. He did prefer a horse over a car, therefore I imagine his daily routine to be up at 8:30, grab breakfast, and head over to the French Brothers stables. They would have had his older white horse saddled and ready by 9:30 each morning. He then rode around the West End, collecting rent and showing property. He made his deposits at the Fifth Third Union Trust Company at around 3 or 4 o'clock, stabled his horse, got home around 5. He would then eat and rest and get ready to monitor the streets at night. Not that he ran the affairs of the night, but now owning 240 properties, something always seemed to happen in the late evening and early mornings. Sometimes it was naked patrons on the roof hiding from the police behind the chimney, or a whole list of other tales that always seemed to make the newspaper. The next morning he got up and repeated the process. On November 28, 1910, he and his brother and his brother's wife gave 700 acres to Covington that is now known as the Devoe Park, with several conditions that included resolution of an ongoing tax debate, and that Charles and his wife Helen would live out their lives on the old homestead, with Charles P. Devou being elected a member of the park board. William P. Devou returned to his routine in the West End of Cincinnati. He was 55 years of age, experienced too much to look for love, too old to have kids, and too young to die. His parents were gone, his brother and his wife were taken care of, and he just wanted to be left alone to his routine and the business of the West End. But change always comes. Business empires are built on change, and they crumble on change. 9 years later, in 1917, the U.S. enters into World War I. Fort Thomas in northern Kentucky is being used to train troops, and the commander of the base wanted prostitution shut down in a 5-mile radius. The city of Cincinnati states that they would oblige. How hard they tried is unclear. Prohibition, though, did close the bars in 1920, and the ladies of George Street started relocating and falling under the control of the mob. The Tenderloin district did remain functional until the 1930s, but it was a different time, different rules, and different players. But by that time, 46,875 people now lived and worked in the Cincinnati West End. 29,332 were black, 17,543 were white. William Devou, now known as Pops on the street, continued his routine in collecting rent. The only change was that the old white horse must have passed away because Old Cap, who ran a shooting gallery, had given William a pony named Babe to ride. This 50-year routine had ingrained itself upon the tellers of the Fifth Third Union Trust Company, and they became alarmed when he went missing for a few days. On November the 17th, 1937, police and the employees of the Fifth Third Union Trust Company broke down the door and crashed a window leading into his room on 338 George Street. According to the newspapers, they called to him and they heard him feebly answer. They found Mr. Devou standing bundled with coats and wearing a cap, which is typical of him, drawn down over his ears. He laughed at the scare that he had caused, and he told his visitors that he was just under the weather. They decided that he needed to be transported to the hospital. This was the second historical thread that brought Mr. Devou into focus for me. The image of the manager of the Fifth Third Union Trust Company breaking into the humble dwellings to check on the older eccentric millionaire humored me. But the fact that it was not a family member, a friend, a wife, or one of the ladies of the past pulled things into perspective. At the hospital, he did complain to the nurses that he'd been kidnapped, and the millionaire died of pneumonia on December the 8th, 1937. A few days later, the bank and his lawyers retrieved documents from the George Street dwelling, and they proclaimed to the press that no documentation indicating a past love had been found. And Babe the pony was taken to the stables at the Devoe Park.
During the late 1940s, the city of Cincinnati announced its urban renewal plans for the West End. Rapidly deteriorating housing, overcrowded living conditions, and a multitude of other urban ills were cited as the reasons behind the urban renewal plan.
In 1949, and in the name of urban redevelopment, city officials made plans to clear out a good portion of the West End. Over the next 20 years, bulldozers cleared way for Interstate 75. Communities were lost, and 30,000 to 40,000 individuals had to find new homes. This became known as the Kenyon-Barr Renewal Area Project. Today, only one block of George Street remains, and this alley faithfully guards its fascinating secrets of the past.